The creation of an entire universe through artistic expression can be a challenging task for many. In the realm of classical music, there are a few that manage to do so with specific precision. One in particular manages to portray an unabashed devotion and religiosity in a work that aims for something divine, where he takes a symphonic form and uses it to tell expressions of the grand scope we all live in. It is that work that I want to celebrate the symphonies of a master, to celebrate the symphonies of someone who revealed the grandiosity, the symphonies of Anton Bruckner. When it comes to any list, especially one I deeply care for, they will inevitably have to be a last place. But while I decided on this format, I don't want this to be a list where I simply list off works on why one is worse than the other. I rather want to examine each symphony and mostly why I love his work, because I love all 9 of his mainline symphonies. With that being said, I still find his first official symphony to be a slightly lesser work than the others despite its soaring highs. The main thing that I can say about it as a fault is the first movement. It is most definitely my least favorite opening from his works, and definitely sounds like Bruckner still easing into the form, which results in some sluggishness while also showcasing potential for what will come. By far, my favorite movement in this symphony is its second slow movement. Its mixture of dark tones and blissful melodies already showcase Bruckner's talent for drama here. I think what stands out as well is his usage of many instruments to their strength. While as you see later on in the list, I do love his mainly emphasis on brass spectacle. I also love his emotional pathos created by the strings and the moment of levity by the woodwinds. They too have this unique quality with all of these reoccurring motifs in the movement, which by the end culminate in the climax that genuinely is breathtaking. To me, this is the first step in his work, where he will move on to the even more transcendent qualities as he reaches higher and higher. The scherzo and finale continue this streak as the very engaging parts. What I always love in his scherzos in particular is the middle softer sections before the repeat of the primary theme, a moment of sentimentality that always shines through, along with it being a very catchy tune. The finale, meanwhile, just works on every level, a solid beginning to what will come soon, which is definitely my summation of this work. A beautiful start overall that only highlights the potential for future works. My next spot is his third symphony, one that admittedly was always the one I had the longest time easing into. Like with a lot of Bruckner's work, for some reason I didn't quite immediately resonate with it, like other works at first, finding it a bit troubling to find some emotional point in this vast architecture of sound, as I like to call it. However, over time, it has slowly faded, and especially the last two movements of the scherzo and finale I really enjoy. While the first two I don't love as much due to me finding them a bit dense in their compositions, they are still incredible work. This symphony is often cited as the one Bruckner himself dedicated to one of his strongest influences, Richard Wagner. You can definitely see that in his use of brass here, as this more heroic tone added to the piece. For a side note, I always thought in turn Wagner was always influenced a lot by Bruckner in his later works, through his capturing of time and space, allowing for some moments of pause in between grand moments, such as this moment from his last opera, Parsifal. For me, the finale is definitely my favorite part, one with a lot of variety, and ending again on a strong finish. A work that definitely does grow with me with every listen. With this fourth symphony, we now enter into one particular aspect of all of Bruckner's symphonies that is hard to avoid, and one I felt best to start speaking about now. With most of Bruckner's work, he composed multiple versions of each symphony, with small tweaks and big changes being made to the compositions, with perhaps the most changes being made to his fourth symphony. Thus, I thought for a while now how I would integrate that into this discussion. Ultimately, I ended up feeling it best to just go with each symphony's latest version, as that is not only what is most played in concerts, but also I find it fair to Bruckner himself that he probably would have these later versions be played the most. With that being said, there are differences between the original, particularly the first two movements, that I think are worth mentioning. There is something with the original 1874 version opening that I do enjoy actually more than the revised version. The same can also be said on the ending to the second slow movement. In many ways, I love both versions. The original sounds more simplistic, but effectively victorious, that truly captures the essence of the Romantic period that Bruckner wouldn't delve that much into. But the original is truly unique, something I can only describe as pure musical alchemy. A hypnotic version that becomes to me an experience of true ecstasy. It's a great part in the original composition. But of course, much of the revised version I still find to be a massive improvement on Bruckner's original writings. The scherzo here makes its boldest stylistic statement in sounding like a pure heroic charge from a knight in shining armor. Or, as my dad said when he was listening to it, it just sounds like the John Williams Superman theme. Along with that, this has to be one of my favorite melodies on the slow part of the scherzo. I always feel a sense of just gliding through a starry night. Just the most peaceful images in general come up into my head. It's a truly beautiful and blissful part that I deeply adore. And then we get to the finale. For me, this finale in particular may be one of my favorite that Bruckner has done, as he uses a constant trick in which he does basically a large elongated crescendo of sound, starting off very soft, leading its way into an even bigger and grander sound, with each second culminating into one big loud explosion to end right after with silence. A truly great ending to a truly great symphony. Once again, this is another symphony with a complicated history, as it being Bruckner's last he wrote before he died, left unfinished with the finale not being fully completed. Of course, there were scholars that tried to bring the finale to life. Particularly, conductor Gerd Schaller tried to revamp the finale into a more authentic version, with him even adding a new coda into the piece. For me though, my decision when it comes to taking these additions into account is to completely remove the finale from this ranking. Don't get me wrong, I admire the ambition to get this symphony completed, but no matter what, we just have the sketches and interpretations. We will never ever have Bruckner himself to be able to confirm his official vision for this piece. Thus, I will only be focusing on the original completed 3-movement piece that we currently have. And there is still a lot to talk about. The first movement immediately establishes the symphony as perhaps the darkest tone that Bruckner would ever write. Even in its rising climaxes, it sounds less like a giant catharsis and more like a building of razor-sharp tension that plunges us further into apocalyptic landscape. Only in sparse moments does this sublime seep in, beautiful as ever, but as a whole, the first movement in particular is a strong but harrowing exploration into our world. The scherzo continues with this thematic, and it might just be my favorite scherzo he ever wrote. While his usual scherzos do contain the strong, bulky moments, here it begins with a setup to what can only be simply described as the origin for all heavy metal music. A violent and rough sound that truly feels ahead of its time for its impact. Mixed in with some more softer moments, the soundscape Bruckner crafts with this movement alone is a work of absolute genius. The third and final movement we will discuss is this humongous slow movement that only just continues what the first movement did, but make it larger, with the climax that I feel is a suitable substitute for a finale that goes towards a dark transcendental vision of the universe around us. ending with a very somber but slightly hopeful message that something can come in the future that will improve what it came before. Even in its unfinished state, this symphony to me is still phenomenal work. As we reach the top 5, we are now into a categorization where I went primarily with my gut instincts and preferences on where I would personally put each symphony. The 6th Symphony is quite simply a masterpiece, and it personally was the first of his that I listened to where I start to get Bruckner. His triumph here is a point where he creates his approach of long chunks and phrases that can stand on their own, that yet when put together, it creates this big structure where to me, its message here, more than most, is the rising journey of soaring through these large landscapes of worlds below us. The first movement shows this immediately, starting with a tremolo effect, like many of Bruckner's later symphonies. It is a gradual setup that gets us excited, and then immediately it erupts with this big, loud noise, immediately going to get us to the next part right after. The second movement, in turn, begins in a more tragic way. Personally, there is something in this opening that just sounds so painful to listen to. It is a beautiful dark part that feels like no matter how much we try and reach for above, we may end up more like Icarus than not. Bruckner's use of chromatic composition in this symphony is truly a marvel to listen to. I thought at first that Bruckner's work would be something very complex, that I had to interpret it over and over again. But the more I observed, the more I see how effectively simple it actually is, especially in his use of thematics that are constantly played with each movement, establishing the exposition and then evolving it in profound ways. This is truly one of Bruckner's greatest achievements, and perhaps, if there's any symphony you should probably start with to immediately get Bruckner's genius, this would definitely be one of my strong recommendations. Not only does it have all of his established aesthetics at their heights, but it also is instantly emotionally resonating and portrays many of Bruckner's ideas as he explores throughout his oeuvre. Once again, a strong masterpiece that only gets better the more I listen to it. This next symphony will definitely be seen by most as my most bold spot on the list, but I genuinely do think that his second symphony is his most underrated achievement as a composer. While many of Bruckner's early work, while solid, did not achieve the same quality as his later works, there is something about his second symphony that just doesn't sound like anything he would do before or after. A personal interpretation I have is that the symphony sounds like Bruckner's farewell to his more classical influences of Beethoven and Schubert, and for the first time, he really flies towards more unique influence as portrayed in this moment from the first movement, starting with something simple that's almost a Schubert-esque melody into this grander scale spectacle as the brass charges in. The second movement, again, is a part that deeply moves me, in both its more melancholic tones and moments of joy, showcasing a feeling of longing, like looking out into the sunset over in the distance as one day comes to an end. The scherzo, meanwhile, is a contender for the most entertaining part in any symphony for me. It's simply just such a blast to listen to for me, and that only gets more and more exciting as it goes along. But then the finale caps it off with mixing all these themes from the previous movements into one giant climax, ending with a motif from the very beginning and leading into something better. This really is one I hope more people discuss and perform, because it is the first time for me Bruckner showcases his genius and how his sound truly is unlike anything from his contemporaries. If I were to say what makes this symphony in particular unique, I would say it aims for an epic quality. To me, it's his largest scale work, where everything from his previous works culminates into this giant beast of a symphony. Even the first movement, which is written as an allegro tempo, feels more appropriate if the tempo were allowed to just slow down, to just allow us to explore the vast scope of this piece, as explosions from the timpanis and the brass constantly fill the place with excitement. There is also something that Bruckner introduces around this late period with the addition of the Wagner tuba, a custom instrument made by Wagner himself for his ring cycle in order to get the perfect sound for the realm of Valhalla. The instrument in generations has come by many names, like the mini tuba, the baritone, and the euphonium. Now, this actually is a big bias for me, because I myself used to play euphonium in my high school marching band, and in general, I gravitate the most towards the brass section. But what makes Bruckner's use of brass the most profound to me personally is the usage of very emotionally intimate moments, and even the use of them as the divine forces from heaven. And it's almost like he sees the brass sometimes as that equivalent to an angelic choir. So at the end of the third movement, I can't help but personally feel on a deep level a sense of gratitude. As much as brass is often known for its ability for loud and grand spectacle, to me, they are equally, if not more so, capable of such intimate and emotional journeys as well. A sign of times gone, a nostalgic reminder of the friends and memories you made that will stay with you forever. That's this symphony's greatest triumph, epic on the biggest and smallest scales.
Through his orchestration, Bruckner can suggest the universe, the expansion of time, the forces of nature, and even the idea of birth and death. How does he accomplish that? Well, how Bruckner designs the themes, how he conceives the themes, is very important to keep in mind, because it's a way of composition that we find is consistent through nearly all of the symphonies.
Our penultimate pick on the list is a symphony that has grown on me the most, and the one that I find the most complex structurally. Out of all of these symphonies, I find this one to be Bruckner attempting a similar structure to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, particularly in this type of finale symphony. Now, what I mean is that everything is set up in the first three movements, and that it's all paid off into the finale. As much as I have praised most of Bruckner's finales so far, I wouldn't say he actually made as much finale symphonies as Beethoven had, with the aforementioned 8th and this symphony being the prime examples of Bruckner's finale symphonies. But this shouldn't suggest that he slacks off beforehand. Quite the opposite. This entire symphony, as a whole, is one of the strongest symphonies I ever heard. The more I listen, the more I am reminded of Beethoven being such a milestone in the medium, and how he'll allow himself to just experiment and try techniques just to be placed there, even if it might seem odd to. Bruckner, in turn, brings a divine quality to the pieces, as his works almost feel like these chunks of blocks that then erupt into a giant clay. In many ways, this is the most Brucknerian Bruckner symphony he ever made, and just how much he uses these specific techniques and how it really doesn't sound like anything that came before or after. The second movement in particular has a moment that for me is one of the most transcendental instrumental works I ever heard. Once again, he uses such a simple trick of a chromatic scale going just upwards to signal an elevation up to the heavens, and the result is just glorious, an awe-inspiring moment in the history of classical music as a whole. The scherzo as well is very maximalist and borderline over the top, with many themes and chunks and pauses, and a section that is almost waltz-like out of anything he wrote, one of his more delightful moments. But of course, it all is because of that finale that makes a symphony what it is, and on every level, it exceeds what it tries to achieve. All the themes come back into play, and the ending is by far Bruckner's greatest climax he ever wrote, the most cathartic ending that for this in particular I dare not spoil. This is definitely one of the greatest symphonies I have ever listened to, and one that reveals more depth with every listen.
Anna, did you hear that?
Listen.
Throughout this entire list, I speak bit by bit about Bruckner as being a sacred artist that was influenced by his devout Catholic beliefs. I personally remember when I first got into him through his motets like Ave Maria, and then when it came to his symphonies, admittedly, I did fail to see where that religiosity was. But it really was when I came to this symphony, and it really is extremely rare, even as someone who's listened to this kind of music all my life, that the first moments of a piece will immediately move me to tears. To me, this is the greatest symphony ever made, a work that purely speaks of the divine, and one that even after many times re-listening to it, I can't help but just sob and truly get an emotional experience from this. This truly did change the way I looked at all classical music, and I know I'm not alone in that regard when it comes to this piece's acclaim. So with that being said, it can be difficult to say anything new about it. But as a whole, what I can say, it really is Bruckner at its most finite. The first movement, which is my personal favorite, is the ultimate use of themes with exposition and payoff. There are 3 simple themes that are established, and then they are developed flawlessly all the way to that end with that brilliant coda. While I really love the scherzo and finale, I'm sure if anyone has heard of Bruckner, chances are they most likely know him for his second movement, this slow funeral march-esque part that just really just drags and tugs at the heartstrings. Here, Bruckner presents a part that feels like music of someone saying goodbye to a dear friend as they move on to another world, tapping into something truly transcendental for all times. Of course, the influence being how around this time when Bruckner wrote the 7th Symphony, Wagner had died before he had completed it, which for Bruckner himself must have been a harrowing loss for him personally. I myself, when I listen to this, sounds like a farewell. As I said in the 8th Symphony, he also uses the Wagner tuba, in an even more obvious way to symbolize Wagner himself. But at the same time, it has this universality for me because, again, I listen to this somber yet slightly hopeful message and I simply ponder and absorb everything I hear. That's the ultimate takeaway from this symphony. I just ponder and truly just absorb it, think about it, feel it, and it stays with me. And I believe it will always stay with me for a very, very long time. Even as I conclude this ranking and this analysis, and I have to reflect and conclude right here, I still feel like there's so much more to say about his work. Again, not only changed the way I look at classical music, but of all art itself, realizing there is that potential for this divinity and this emotional resonance that truly can reach for the heights. Without getting too personal, my religious views have been challenged, and sometimes I feel conflicted and feel like there's no simple answer I can give as to who I truly am individually when it comes to these beliefs, or even if I have any at all. But I know for one thing, that art like this, it makes me believe, even for just a moment, that there is something way above in places I could never see, that look down and are protecting me, that are trying to speak to me. That is what great art can do, to truly make you believe the unbelievable. And Bruckner is truly that which exemplifies all that I appreciate about art and life itself.